And I'm Morgan Mendelson.
And I'm Sophie Stinnett.
And I'm Jared Samuels.
And we're bringing you the 8th episode of What's Behind the Game, where you'll get an exclusive look at how all your favorite athletes eat, train, and anything else you'd like to know. Today on the show, we have Stephen Dansevich. Stephen is a trainer at Austin Muscle Restoration and has a deep knowledge of the muscular and nervous system. He uses many innovative methods to approach training in a new and interesting way. So let's welcome Stephen.
Thank
you. Hello.
So how did you start your journey with fitness?
I'm hesitant to go into too much detail because then you can find out how old I am. But let's say it goes back a long ways. Gosh, when I was a teenager and young, I was involved in sports and athletics to some extent. I first started trying exercising on a consistent and sort of structured basis in my 20s, but it was just doing stuff at home and not knowing really anything except what I might read in an occasional magazine. Eventually I moved into a place that had a fitness room with some fitness equipment, and that gave me exposure to some more stuff and just started diving into it a little bit more. And then, oh gosh, I'm going to date myself. So I'm in my 30s, so I'm older than 30. I joined one of the earlier versions of a gym or a health club, which had just tons of equipment, but it was all self-taught, all just self-directed. And at some point, I figured I needed to get some more level of expertise than just what I could learn myself. And so I started working with a personal trainer who, based on the certifications he had at the time, knew some stuff, although there weren't many certifications out there then.
Right.
And he could sense that I was more interested than just a typical client, and he actually suggested that I pursue a certification. So I did, and got one, and then got several more. And then started training professionally, not quite 20 years ago. And about 10 years ago, I started diving deep into some certifications that were focused more on biomechanics and kinesiology. And once I started to do that, I started to veer off in a direction that was much more, I guess you could say, clinically based than what a typical trainer does. And that's what I've been doing for the last 10 years. I will say that if you're at all serious about being a fitness professional, it should be a constant learning process. I found that the more I learn, the more I realize I still don't know. So as I get one thing, that sort of directs me onto something else. And even now I'm working on a certification on some stuff that's an extension of things that I've been working on for the last several years. So it never stops, or at least it shouldn't stop.
Always learning.
That's awesome.
When you started taking that deep dive like 10 years ago, or even however long you started, we talk a lot about RTS. What is different? Like, what makes what you learned and what you do different than the average trainer?
RTS stands for Resistance Training Specialist. It was developed by a man named Tom Purvis out of Oklahoma City. Back in the 80s, he was a pretty successful bodybuilder, then became a physical therapist, and he still has a practice up in Oklahoma City. And I'm not sure how far back the certification goes, but the best way to describe it is it focuses on the science of exercise. And we talk about the science of exercise, we're mainly talking about physics, because exercise is essentially about forces acting on and within your body. And the best way to understand exercise is to have a better understanding of those forces. And to understand the forces within your body, you have to have a better understanding of muscle and joint function. So it's kind of like looking at the exercise from the inside out, not from the outside in. It also works off the premise that every body, B-O-D-Y, is different. And what might be an appropriate form of exercise for one body, one person, might not be for another. So you're trying to figure out, if I'm working with specific clients, the first thing I need to figure out is what's going on with their body, both positively and negatively. The stuff that's negative are the things I can do about it, or do I just have to work with them? And then try to design an exercise program that's in line with both their goals and their capabilities. It's very specific to the individual, and it looks at each person as a unique information set, I guess you could say.
Yeah. When you talk about the unique differences between people, is that what gets you your opinion on stretching? Because we kind of see that or know that you have a controversial opinion on stretching. So can you explain that a little bit more?
Not the right word is controversial or contrarian or counterintuitive. It's a little bit of all of them. And when we say stretching, it can mean different things to different people. But with most of the clients that I've worked with over the years, their understanding of stretching generally involves taking joints and moving things into positions that they can't necessarily move on their own, or what we would call passive motion versus active motion. And then usually holding them there for a length of time. And that's done on the assumption that they have this sensation of tightness that they feel they need to address. And the assumption that the tightness is the problem, whereas the people that I work with and that sort of think like me, look at the tightness as a symptom of something else. Usually we assume that tightness is a protective mechanism because your body is going into a position that your brain senses either weakness or instability. So that tightness is a protective mechanism, and for you to stretch to undo that protection without providing something in exchange for that is actually possibly creating weakness and putting joints at risk and creating vulnerability. And more often than not, I can improve someone's range of motion without doing any kind of stretching. So if I'm able to do that, then those muscles might not be tight, they might be tightening due to weakness or instability somewhere else. So I myself and with my clients, I don't do any sort of, certainly not any kind of aggressive stretching. I may occasionally, depending on what I'm doing with them, take them into passive ranges, but I'm doing so very carefully and cautiously and not cranking their joint into a position where they normally can't take it themselves. A lot of people will say they stretch because it feels good, which is fine, but the line I like to use is, so does cocaine and unprotected sex. That doesn't necessarily mean they're a good thing.
Oh my God.
Sorry, I had to throw that in there. So to that extent, I guess it is, and certainly with trainers I still talk to, I guess it is sort of controversial. But when you start asking them specific questions about why they're stretching and what they think they're trying to address, a lot of times they can give you answers that really make sense. So that's kind of where I come from.
That's like an interesting way to like approach stretching. I've never like thought of it in that sense. But what would like be your, like, what about gymnasts? You know, like they say stretching increases flexibility. Is that?
I tend not to. I don't use the word flexibility. I use the word mobility. It's one thing to be able to move a joint or a limb throughout a certain range of motion, but for me, if I can, I'm going to move my phone here. If I can bring my arm up so high, and that's my active range of motion, that's kind of nice. I have some people that can't, but if I can bring it up this high and I try to create some resistance there to see if you can hold that position and you can't, that for me is a potential vulnerability. Yeah. If you have a certain amount of range of motion, I would want you to have pretty good muscle function throughout that range. And I worked with a lot of people who are flexible, they have mobility, but they don't have strength and stability in a lot of those end range positions. And I see that as a potential vulnerability or a potential source of weakness. So we use the word, not flexibility, but mobility. And we're thinking of not only what are their available joint positions, but what is their strength or their contractile ability throughout that range? And that's more important to me than just how far they can move stuff.
Do you think those stretching misconceptions are like the biggest mistakes you see in athletes when they're strength training?
It's very common, yes.
Yeah.
It's very pervasive throughout the fitness industry as a whole, and certainly in competitive sports. And there's a thing I do sometimes where I will do a test of a certain position and their ability to hold that position that involves them activating certain muscles. And then I will have them passively, sort of aggressively stretch the muscles that were involved in trying to hold that position. And then retest that position. And 99 times out of 100, that test goes weak. So the stretching actually had an inhibitory effect and at least temporarily weakened the muscles involved in that. Now, that doesn't mean that would last forever. But for me, doing something that weakens muscles as opposed to strengthen them is not something I would normally want to do. And then there's the idea that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me is people feel the need to stretch after a workout. And I'm thinking, oh, this is kind of funny. You're going through this whole workout and doing all these exercises to make you stronger, to help you move better. And then when you're done with that, you have to stretch to undo all the stuff that you were doing as part of the workout. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me.
Right. Like, do you think, I mean, I've always heard that if you stretch after like a workout, it like reduces soreness, but you're saying it has like the reverse effect?
It might do those things. I'm not going to argue with that. For me, I'm a muscle system guy. I work on trying to improve the contractile ability of the muscle system because that's key to a lot of other things in terms of health and fitness and how well you can move. So anything that detracts from that, I'm wary of. Now I will say, and especially when you're dealing with athletes, sometimes their muscle system is so resilient and so rock solid that they could stretch the hell out of things and still be fine. But athletes tend to be the exception and not the rule, and certainly for the general population. And there's just this default assumption that I have to stretch. And again, when you ask them why they need to stretch, they'll say, "Well, I have to stretch because I'm tight." And they say, "Well, why are you tight?" "Well, because I don't stretch." And that's kind of a circular argument that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me.
I've never I really am like surprised because I've never like thought of the approach in that sense. I've always just like exactly how you said, or stretch because you're tight. That's just like how.
And then again, the question is, why are you tight? Is
Yeah.
that tightness a protective mechanism? Is that tightness due to structural limitations that you really can't do much about? My coworker, he and I are about the same height and roughly the same proportions. If we lie on a table and do a straight leg raise, I can get to probably 75, 80 degrees without any problem. He gets to about 45 degrees and he runs out of range. Now, what's happening physiologically there is I have a lot more length on the backside and my hamstrings and things on the posterior side that he doesn't have. And that's a structural thing that he can't change no matter how much you try to stretch things. So that's a structural issue. You can stretch till the cows come home, but it's not necessarily going to improve his hip flexion.
Yeah. I like how you take into account like everyone's like bodies are different, which is true. And it's kind of like in the aspect of like in school, like everyone learns a different way and you're doing that.
Exactly.
You're taking that concept and bringing it into like actual training that everybody's bodies are different as well.
The line we like to use when people ask us about exercise and different types of exercising and different programs, we have a very simple answer, and we tell people there are no rules for exercise, there are rules for your body. And if what you're doing from an exercise standpoint does not match up to the rules of your body, then there are risks involved, and you could long-term be doing more harm than good.
Yeah. So what should athletes start doing if they want to like start training this way?
One thing is it really helps to think not just with exercises, not just what's happening externally, what's moving, or moving away from point A to point B, thinking what's happening inside the body. So thinking sort of internally. Another thing to realize is that effective exercise is not about trying to kill yourself every time you go in the gym. The thing that had the most positive long-term effect on me and my own exercise and fitness was accepting that, and also realizing that the best way to exercise on any given day is based on, despite your goals, is how your body feels on that given day in terms from a movement standpoint and also an energy standpoint. I have some injury history involving my right shoulder, unfortunately from doing dumb stuff in the gym when I was younger. And there are some days when my shoulder moves better than others. And on those days where it doesn't move well or it's kind of cranky, that may make a difference in what exercises I might doing that involve the shoulder. There may be some things I just don't do on that day, but there are other days where everything is feeling rock solid. And if my energy level is good, then I might push myself more on those days. But the idea that every time you walk in the gym, no matter what, you have to go 100% and just try to destroy things because that's the only way you'll make improvements. Even resilient bodies like with athletes, they can only tolerate so much of that. So that's really important as well.
What are some other consequences if like resistance exercise isn't done right?
Well, number one, on the assumption that exercise should be goal specific, you're trying to accomplish certain things. If you're not doing them the right way, there's less of a chance that you're going to meet those goals. There's more of a chance that your body will compensate to try and do what you're trying to do. And depending on how your body is working, those compensations may, in the long run, create issues. The most common thing is overuse. But then we actually see some specific injuries developing from that. And there's some systemic things that can go on too. You know, I think the research is kind of up and down in terms of how it affects your immune system. But it can definitely have some systemic effects that can in turn affect how well you can perform and how well you exercise. There's a tendency to think that if a little bit of exercise is good, then a lot of exercise is even better. And I would be very wary of that. Again, athletes tend to have higher tolerances and their thresholds are higher, and you can probably push them higher. But it's certainly easy to push them too far. And athletes are the exception and not the rule. And when you're working with just general population, and depending on the issues that they have, and a lot of people that I work with, their thresholds are extremely low. And I have to be very careful with them.
Is that when, so I guess what I was going to ask is, how do you know when an athlete is ready to train again? Is it based on kind of like their specific pain or their specific area? Is there like a timing?
Pain certainly factors in. The stuff that I do along with my associate, we do a lot of range of motion and muscle testing to see how the body is responding to force in various positions, configurations. If I get someone on the table and I'm doing some basic muscle testing and they're not responding well, number one, I might try to investigate that and see what's driving that. But that can help me to make a decision in terms of what I may want to focus on that day or what I may want to try and avoid on that day.
Yeah.
So we do some assessments both when we first meet with a new client. That includes getting a pretty detailed injury history, getting a good idea of what they've been doing from an exercise and an activity standpoint, but then actually testing them in terms of range of motion and strength on a table and in various other configurations to see how well their body is responding. And if we see some things going on that we think we can address, certainly in the short term, I might take a step back and work on some of those things. But we might also decide, well, there's some stuff we just don't want them doing right now until we can explore this further and see if we can improve on that, and in the process improve what they can do from an exercise standpoint. So the assessment process is ongoing from when we first start to work with them, and then sometimes from session to session.
Yeah. Are there a lot of restraints with cardio, or do you have an approach to cardio and a certain exercise?
There are a lot of people that assume that they, if you go to a typical big box gym, number one, they devote a lot of floor space to the cardio machines.
Yeah. Okay.
And I see a lot of people spending a lot of time on there. What I've sort of developed over time is, if you do things away from the gym that require a lot of endurance, then by all means you should do some stuff that requires endurance. Mm-hmm. If you don't do a whole lot of stuff away from the gym that involves that, I wouldn't automatically assume that you still have to get on the stationary bike or a treadmill and do 35 or 40 minutes. That type of longer steady state stuff, number one, long term, it's not the most efficient way to burn calories. So if you're looking at weight loss, I wouldn't recommend that specifically. Number two, it tends to be more muscle wasting than muscle building. If you look at your typical endurance athlete versus your typical strength athlete, you can see the differences there. And then thirdly, if you have existing movement issues, and you're getting on an apparatus and moving for a long period of time, that could exacerbate those existing movement issues. If you have some foot or knee or hip issues and you're running on a treadmill or walking on a treadmill for a length of time, that might not be the best thing for your foot, your knee, or your hip.
Yeah, of course.
What I do now tends to be more interval based, because I think it tends to be a little bit more bang for your buck. I can do some stuff in literally a matter of minutes that jacks my heart rate up pretty good, and doesn't exacerbate any movement issues. And I tend to do more of that. But if you have people that like to run or like to bike or like to hike, I'm certainly not going to discourage them from doing that, and doing some that more traditional endurance based stuff be fine for them.
Yeah.
Where does strength training fit into like an athlete's overall training regimen for their sport? Like, where should it fit? How should someone place like the hierarchy of it?
I guess you could think from a foundational standpoint, they have to, if the contractile ability of their muscles is lacking in some way, then that's going to carry over into the actual performance of their sport and the skills that are required for that. So if they don't have a good foundation of strength, if muscles aren't contracting well in both a broad sense and in a more specific sense, they need to address that. So even endurance athletes need to spend time on strength. And beyond that, you're getting things a little bit more specific to the sport. If you look at the skills and the movements that are involved in the sport, then you can get more specific. For an athlete, it also depends on, from a time standpoint, if it's preseason or during the season or postseason, and there can be differences as to how you would want to work with them depending on where they are in a time sense.
Yeah, I think, I would agree that that's how a lot of coaches make mistakes, because they don't specialize, or they don't individualize their players or their athletes by what their problems are.
And if you got a large group of, if it's a team sport and you got a large group of people and you're trying to condition them, unfortunately, even though they're athletes, you still run into the same problem, is that these bodies are different, and one body is different than the other. And when I work with some young athletes and they tell me what their coaches or their strength coaches are doing from an exercise standpoint, sometimes it scares the crap out of me, because they're taking some old kind of traditional stuff that and without really being well grounded in resistance mechanics, and sometimes I'm afraid they're just beating up these bodies, and that scares me.
Yeah,
and it's exactly what you said earlier too, that you're constantly learning, one thing changes to another. So if some of these coaches can just continue to stay with the traditional stuff, they have no idea
there's no evolution.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if they're doing stuff because that's what their coach did when they were in high school or college, and it made men out of them, that's fine. But they're leaving a lot of stuff on the table, and again, with some of the athletes I've worked on, when they tell me what their coaches do, I seriously question their knowledge of muscle and joint function and resistance mechanics. I'm sorry, but that's what I see.
Yeah, and I feel like also too, it has to deal with like kids with you probably see like people who get ACL tears, like not properly strengthening like those muscles and things like that, because somebody may
That's interesting you bring that up, because my friend and I, my associate and I, were talking the other day about I think one of our clients brought up the number of ACL tears, and I don't know whether it's football or whatever. And we said, we wonder how many of those were non-contact injuries. It's one thing if someone crashes into your knee while you're running, or you step into an uneven surface and it creates a scenario where something has to give. But otherwise, those non-contact things, you wonder if there was some pre-existing weaknesses that had just been gradually building, and all it took was that one little perfect storm of position or motion and force, and things went snap. And had the training been more effective, would that have happened? We kind of wonder about that.
Right. Yeah, I agree. What would be your recommendations for like young athletes? Like if you had 3 like words of advice or something for a young athlete, what would it be?
First thing is check your ego at the door.
Of course. Yes.
I'm sorry, but if you don't, it's especially with young athletes who are literally oozing testosterone, and you get 2 or 3 of them together, and that oozing has this compound effect, and it turns into a competition, and they're trying to outdo each other. And again, different bodies with different capabilities. So just literally check your ego at the door. It's not necessarily about how much you can move, but how well you can move it. And the other thing is listen to your body and adjust your workouts accordingly. It goes back to what I said earlier. It shouldn't be about killing yourself every time you walk in the gym. Sometimes workouts should be less than 100% intensity. And the other thing is be more focused. Think more internally, not just externally. We also stress the concept of what we call variability, and that is understanding the way muscle and joints function. There are lots of different ways to challenge them, and if you just rely on a very limited set of exercises with a very limited set of equipment, now it's one thing if that's all you have access to, I understand. One of my jobs as a muscle system specialist and a personal trainer is be creative with the stuff that I have access to. But there are so many different ways to challenge muscles and joints. And if you just rely on the same limited set of exercises without taking into account the variability of how muscles and joints move, I think it's going to limit the types limit the amount of strength you have, and the types of gains you can make, and it'll limit how strong and how durable your body is.
Yeah, of course. Jared, did you have any more follow-ups?
No, I think I'm good.
Okay.
Thank you so much for coming on.
That was extremely interesting.
Yeah, definitely information.
I would say it's one thing to talk about these things. It's kind of cool, and Jared's actually had some of these things demonstrated on him. So for example, when we talked about that thing about stretching, and some people are probably listening and going, and they're putting up these blocks, and they're doing the little crucifix kind of thing, like, oops, like this. Say, no, stay away. But what we try to do is have intelligent conversations and demonstrate some of these things that we're talking about. So if I can pique the curiosity, people's curiosity about some of these things, and it's kind of cool when you can actually demonstrate, and then at least that plants a seed and gets people thinking.
No, yes, it's definitely It's not nonsense at all. I heard it and was like, that makes sense.
Yeah, it
Because
does.
it's like everybody is different.
And we also stress
Yeah.
from a professional standpoint, but I think individuals, athletes should do this too, is always ask honest questions of themselves when they're doing stuff. In my own personal history doing it, I went through this phase where I was really big on functional training. We could have a whole discussion about that, but I could do some really cool looking circus trick kind of exercises. And it was a great stroke to my ego for one thing. And it got me a lot of attention, and that was kind of nice. And I can still do some of those exercises and people could look and go, wow, that's really cool. But when I started asking questions, okay, this is cool to do, but is it actually benefiting my body in any particular way? And when I started asking those questions, I go, probably not. So, you know, if I want to do it to show off to someone, I might, but they're no longer part of my exercise regimen. So that idea of always asking questions, honest questions to yourself about what you're doing. And am I doing this just because it makes me look good, or because, you know, I'm strong in this one position, but I'm ignoring all these other positions when I'm not as strong? I think you always need to ask those questions.
Right.
Well, thank
Yeah,
you.
I definitely think that. Oh, yeah, I was gonna say the idea of checking your ego at the door, like that's huge.
Oh, yeah,
Because
yeah, for sure.
you get with a group of
And
guys
it's so
and they
hard to
just
do
automatically.
from my own experience too. And I'm an old fart, so it's a little easier to do. But for young athletes, I know it's hard. And but if they're working with me and if they don't check their ego at the door, I will take their ego out of their brain and place it on the floor. And I try to do it in a gentle way, but at some point that has to happen. So.
But it makes sense to do that, because if they don't, they're not gonna like work as hard, and they're just never gonna think that there's room for improvement.
There's no reality.
And we could get and this ties into more of the physics of exercise and what anyone tries to do, especially when they're trying to remove large amounts of weight, and what they're having to do to be able to move that weight. And there is a skill to that. I understand that. But they think that certain things are happening with certain muscles, and I can pretty easily show them that those things aren't happening. And with the things that they think they're working on, they're probably not working on very effectively.
Right.
And if their goal is to actually work on certain things, then they need to check their ego at the door and lower the weight and focus more on control. And for some of them, that's hard to do. But if they can't do it long term, they're going to pay a price sooner or later.
Exactly. Well, anything else?
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
I'm going to go to the gym and get swole now. So
I need to get out of this closet.
Have a good rest of the day.
Bye.
Okay.
Have a good day.